She was the one who kept the coffee warm. That was all Darnell Osei knew about her at first. He had walked into that diner on the worst night of his life, a Tuesday in late November, with $12 in his coat pocket and his last name on a termination letter folded flat against his chest. He had not eaten since morning. The bus back to his sister's apartment did not run until 11, and it was barely 7, and the rain outside was the kind that soaked through everything. Through the coat, through the pride, through whatever thin wall a man builds between himself and the truth of his situation. He sat at the counter because the booths felt like they were for people who had somewhere to be. The woman behind the counter did not fuss over him. She did not treat him with the careful, pitying kindness of someone who had spotted a man down on his luck and decided to make a project of him. She just looked at him the same way she looked at the retired schoolteacher 3 stools down and the young couple splitting a slice of pie in the corner. She looked at him like he was a person. She set down a menu, told him the soup was good that night, and went back to refilling waters. Her name tag said, Renee. Darnell ordered the soup and a roll, and when he realized the total came to $11.70, he felt his chest tighten in a way it hadn't since his father's funeral. He left a quarter. He set it on the counter very carefully, like the act of placing it precisely might carry some dignity the amount itself could not. Then he sat there in the warmth for another hour because nobody asked him to leave. When he finally stood to go, Renee set a paper bag on the counter in front of him. "Leftover cornbread," she said. "We'd throw it out anyway." He knew it wasn't leftover. He said, "Thank you," and picked up the bag and walked out into the rain. What Renee Patterson did not know, sitting down to count her tips that night, was that the man with the wet coat and the quarter was named Darnell, that he was 34 years old, and that 3 years from that evening, he would be the new regional director of a restaurant group that had just purchased the building she worked in, the one that housed this diner, the one that would either keep the place running or fold it into something else. She had no idea. She was thinking about the $11 electricity bill she owed, and whether her daughter's cold had turned into something worse, and whether the cornbread she had quietly slipped into a bag for a quiet stranger was going to cause her manager to dock the cost from her next check. She did not think about it for more than a minute. Then she turned off the light above her station and went home. That was 3 years, 2 months and 14 days before everything changed. Renee was 31 years old, and she had been a waitress at Caldwell's Diner for 6 of them. She had started on a Wednesday in March, the week after her daughter Cora was born, because her mother had agreed to watch the baby during the morning shift, and Renee had needed something steady, something with hours she could predict, something that paid in cash at the end of every night. She had not planned to stay 6 years. She had not planned a lot of things. The diner sat on the corner of Merchant Street and 5th, a place that had been there since the 1970s and that still had the same laminate countertop and the same overhead menu board with the same plastic letters that someone had been reordering for decades. The owner, Mr. Caldwell, was 68 and mostly sat in the office in the back doing crossword puzzles and drinking coffee that was older than some of the staff. He was not a cruel man. He was a largely absent one. The diner ran because Renee ran it, because she knew every regular's name and order, because she opened at 5:45 every morning and sometimes did not leave until the afternoon shift was stable, and because she had never once called in sick in 6 years, not even the morning after Cora's ear surgery, when she had sat in a hospital waiting room until 2 a.m. and then gone home and set her alarm for 4:30. Cora was 6 now. She had her mother's eyes and her absent father's stubborn streak and a laugh that started in her whole body before it ever reached her face. She was in 1st grade. She liked frogs and the colour orange and a television program about a small dog who solved neighbourhood mysteries. She didn't yet understand that the apartment they lived in was the cheapest one in the building, or that the reason her mother's shoes were the same shoes she had worn for 4 years was that Renee had been replacing Cora's shoes every 6 months as she grew. She didn't understand any of this. She thought their life was fine, and Renee worked very hard to keep it that way. The tips were what made the math work. On a good week, Renee cleared enough to cover rent, daycare, the electric bill, groceries, and Cora's Thursday afternoon reading tutor. On a bad week, she moved things around. She had become very skilled at moving things around. She knew exactly how long she could let one bill sit before it became a problem, and she knew which problem she could absorb and which one she couldn't, and she carried all of this knowledge like a second job that nobody paid her for. She had not had a bad week that Tuesday in late November when Darnell came in from the rain. She had had a bad month. Her car had needed a brake job in October. $340, which came out of the account she kept for emergencies, which meant the account was now at $72, which meant the margin between her family and a real crisis was $72. She had been running the numbers in her head for 4 weeks. She had not told her mother. She had not told anyone. When she gave the man in the wet coat the cornbread, she was not performing generosity. She did not think of it as an act of grace. She thought of it as the thing you did when someone in front of you was cold and hungry, and you had something warm in your hand. She thought her mother would have done the same. She thought most people with any decency would have done the same, except she had been in this business long enough to know that was not true. She went home. She woke up at 4:30. She did her job. The months passed the way they do when you're busy and tired and not really watching, which is to say fast in the abstract and slow in the specific, both at once. Cora started losing teeth. The tips picked up slightly in spring when the neighborhood got warmer and people started walking more. The brake job account climbed back to 200, then 3, then a little over 4. Renee took a Sunday class at the community centre, a food service management course, because Mr. Caldwell had once said vaguely that he was thinking about making her a floor manager, and she thought it might help her case. She did not know that Mr. Caldwell had quietly put out inquiries to sell the building. She found out the way most people find out about things in a small diner. She overheard a conversation she wasn't meant to hear between Mr. Caldwell and a man in a good coat who had come in on a Wednesday morning when the place was nearly empty, who had walked the length of the dining room and back, looking at the ceiling and the floor, and had sat down with Mr. Caldwell in the far corner booth and spoken in the low, efficient tones of someone conducting business. She caught the words square footage and lease terms and transition period, and she felt the floor shift under her in a way that had nothing to do with the worn linoleum. She did not ask. She finished her shift. That night she put Cora to bed, and she sat at the kitchen table with her bills fanned out in front of her, and she did the thing she had been disciplining herself not to do, which was think about what she would do if the diner closed. She had no resume. She had a 6-year gap of cash wages and tips that she had reported honestly on her taxes, but that did not translate into references and letters and the language that got you through the door somewhere else. She had a certificate from a food service management course she had taken on Sunday mornings while her mother watched Cora. She had a very specific knowledge of how to run a diner, but a diner that might not exist in 6 months. She put the bills back in their folder and went to bed. She did not sleep well. The news that reached the staff 2 weeks later was that the building had been purchased by a company called Linden Food Group, which operated 11 mid-scale restaurants across 3 states and had recently moved into acquiring and renovating underperforming diner properties and repositioning them. The staff meeting, held on a Monday morning before the breakfast rush, was run by a woman named Diane from what she called the transition team, who used the phrase, "We're excited about the opportunity" 4 times and the word rebrand 3 times, and who never directly answered when one of the cooks asked whether all the current staff would be retained. Renee stood near the back and said nothing. She took notes in a small spiral pad she kept in her apron pocket. After Diane left, Mr. Caldwell sat down at the counter with a cup of coffee and looked at the tabletop for a long time. Then he said, without looking up, "The new manager comes Thursday." That was a Tuesday. Renee had 2 days. She spent them doing her job with the same precision she always brought to it, which meant the coffee was hot and the orders were right and the regulars got what they always got without having to ask. She called the tutor and rescheduled Cora's Thursday session just in case the Thursday was complicated. She went home each night and looked at her certificate on the kitchen table and thought about whether to bring it with her or leave it at home. She brought it with her. On Thursday morning, she was at the diner at 5:40, which was 5 minutes earlier than usual, because she was not going to be caught arriving after someone else. She turned on the lights and the coffee and stood behind the counter and waited. At 8:15, the door opened. The man who walked in was tall, lean in the shoulders, wearing a dark jacket over a clean grey sweater. He was 37 maybe. He carried himself the way people do when they have been trained to move through rooms like they belong in them. He had a leather portfolio under one arm and a travel mug in his hand that he set down on the counter with the ease of a man who had been coming to diner counters his whole life. He looked at the space. He looked at the counter. He looked at Renee. Something shifted in his face. It was a small thing. If she had been looking somewhere else, she would have missed it. But she was looking directly at him, the way she looked at everyone who came through the door. and she saw it a fraction of a second where his expression changed, where the professional composure was replaced by something else, something that might have been recognition, or might have been surprise, and then it settled back into pleasantness. He said, "I'm Darnell Osei. I'm the new regional director." Renee said, "Renee Patterson. I opened this place." He nodded slowly. He set the portfolio on the counter and looked around the room one more time, and then he looked at her again, and she still could not read his face, and she had been reading faces behind this counter for 6 years. He said, "Can I get a cup of coffee while we talk?" She poured it. If you are wondering what Darnell was thinking in those first moments, the answer is that he was thinking several things at once, in the way that people do when the past walks back into the room without warning. He was thinking, that is her, and of course it is, and thinking about a paper bag with cornbread in it, about the quarter on the counter, about the rain, about the way she had not looked at him with pity, and how much that had mattered on a night when everything else had. He had thought about that diner 100 times in 3 years. He had thought about it the way you think about a pivot point, a night that looked, in hindsight, like the last night of one part of your life and the first night of another. He had not gone back because he had not been sure what he would say, and because the work of rebuilding had left little room for backward glances. He had gone from his sister's couch to a junior coordinator position at a food group in the city, and then from that to a regional manager role, and from there, 18 months ago, to the director position at Linden when they were building out their acquisition arm. He had not known when Linden put this property on the list that it was the same diner. He had known when he pulled up the address the night before and sat very still for a moment. He had not told anyone. Now he sat at the counter and drank his coffee, and he and Renee talked about the diner. She had brought her certificate. She set it on the counter between them like a card she was laying down carefully, not sure of the stakes. She told him about the food service management course, about the regulars and their orders, about the schedule she had built that reduced labour costs on slow mornings without leaving the floor short during the rush. She told him what she knew about the equipment, which pieces were reliable and which ones were waiting to fail, which suppliers were punctual and which ones required follow-up calls. She was matter-of-fact. She did not oversell. She did not perform. Darnell listened. He asked her questions that were more specific than she expected. Questions about seat turnover and average ticket size and the split between dine-in and take-out, and she answered all of them because she knew the answers, because she had been running the numbers in her head for 6 years. She answered and watched him write in the portfolio and did not let herself think about what the meeting meant or where it was going, because she had taught herself that thinking too far ahead was a way of disappointing yourself efficiently. At the end of the hour, he looked at his notes and then at her. He said, "What do you want? For yourself, not for the diner." Nobody had ever asked her that in a professional conversation. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to still have a job in 6 months, and I want it to be a job where somebody actually uses what I know." Darnell nodded. He picked up the portfolio and the travel mug. He said he had 3 more location visits this week and that she would hear from the transition team by end of the following week regarding staffing decisions. She said, "Thank you for the coffee time." He said, "Thank you for the conversation." He walked to the door. Then he stopped. He turned back and said, "One more thing. Is there a cornbread here? On the menu?" She looked at him steadily. "No, it's not on the menu." "It should be," he said. And then he went out. She stood at the counter for a long moment after the door closed. Then the bell above it rang again because a regular named Harold was coming in for his 7:30, which was now 8:45, and Harold was going to need his coffee and his eggs and his particular explanation for why he was late to everything, and the morning was not going to wait for her to figure out what had just happened. She poured Harold's coffee. She did not hear from the transition team in a week. She heard from them in 5 days. The woman from the transition team, not Diane this time, a quieter woman named Loretta, who spoke in complete sentences and did not use the word rebrand, called on a Tuesday afternoon and told Renee that the Linden Group was keeping the location, that it would operate as a diner with an updated menu and a modest renovation, and that they were offering her the general manager position. The salary Loretta named was nearly double what Renee had made in tips and wages combined in a good year. Renee sat down. She was still wearing her apron. She sat down on the kitchen chair with the apron still on and held the phone and said nothing for a moment. And Loretta, to her credit, waited. Then Renee said, "Can I ask why me?" Loretta said, "Mr. Osei's recommendation was unambiguous." That night after Cora was in bed, Renee sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had spread out her bills 4 weeks earlier, and she turned the offer over in her mind, the way you turn something fragile over in your hands, carefully, from every angle, making sure you understand the shape of it before you commit to holding it. She thought about the salary. She thought about what the salary meant. Cora's shoes, always. The account that never dropped to $72 again. The tutor on Thursdays without rescheduling, maybe in a year or two a different apartment, the kind with a second bedroom. She thought about the man who had come in from the rain. She had given him cornbread because he needed something warm. It had cost her maybe $1.50 in diner food she had no authority to give away. She had not thought about it since. She had not expected anything from it. That was the only reason she had done it. That was the reason the world, when it finally circled back, felt so precise. She called her mother. Her mother listened. Then she said, very quietly, "Renee, take the job." Renee said, "I'm going to take the job." Her mother said, "Good. Now tell me what's wrong with the apartment you have now." Renee laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that arrives when something that has been held very tightly for a very long time suddenly has room to move. It came up from somewhere below her ribs and surprised her, and she pressed her hand over her mouth the way she always did when a feeling arrived bigger than she was expecting. She accepted the position the next morning. She called Loretta at 8 a.m., standing in the diner's kitchen in her apron, an hour before she had to open, because that was who she was, and she did not see any reason to pretend otherwise. There were things about the transition that were hard. Not cruel, not dishonest, but hard in the way that real change is always hard when you are the person responsible for carrying it. Mr. Caldwell retired, which was not a surprise, and Renee found herself in an odd in-between space for 2 weeks where she was technically the manager, but the renovation had not started yet, and the staff looked at her differently, with a mix of relief and uncertainty that she recognized because she had felt it herself for most of the previous month. She held 2 staff meetings. She was direct. She told them who was staying and who was not, and she was honest about why. And she did not dress it up. 2 people lost their hours. It was the hardest part. She had worked beside them for years. The renovation took 3 weeks. The diner came back with new lighting over the counter and a fresh coat of paint on the booths. Deep red, which was close enough to the old colour that the regulars would not be startled, and a menu that kept the core of what the place had always been while adding items that gave the kitchen something to work with. Renee added cornbread. She put it on the menu herself on a Tuesday and did not explain to anyone why. On the day the diner reopened, Darnell came in. He came alone, no portfolio, no travel mug, just himself in a dark jacket, and he sat at the counter like a regular. Renee was behind the counter because she was almost always behind the counter on the days that mattered. She poured his coffee without being asked. He looked at the menu. He saw the cornbread. He looked up at her. She said, "It's good," he said. "I know." She did not make a speech about the rain or the bag or the quarter. She did not need to. They were both standing inside the fullness of it, the long arc of a night that had turned out to matter, and there was nothing to add to that. She had thanked him when she accepted the job. He had said that he had simply told the truth of what he saw, which was a person who knew what she was doing and had been doing it without recognition for years. The rest was just the world catching up to what was already true. Harold came in at 8:40 and wanted his coffee and his eggs, and Renee turned to get them. If you have ever been in a diner when the morning rush is starting, you know the sound of it. The door, the register, the coffee pot, the bell above the entrance, the low rumble of conversation from booths filling up. It is not a grand sound. It is one of the most ordinary sounds in the world. Renee had been hearing it for 6 years, and she had never once found it small. That morning, it sounded different. Not louder, not more, just finely somehow, like it was hers. A month after the reopening, Renee was doing inventory on a Thursday afternoon when Cora came in from school with Renee's mother, the way she sometimes did on Thursdays now that the tutor was permanent, and had simply moved her session to the diner's back corner booth, which Cora had decided was the best seat in the building because it had a window and you could see the street. Cora slid into the booth with her reading book and her backpack and said hello to 2 of the kitchen staff by name because she had been coming here her whole life and she knew everyone. Renee watched her from behind the counter. Cora was 6 years old, and she had her mother's eyes and her absent father's stubborn streak, and she was reading at a second-grade level, which the tutor had told Renee was something to be proud of, and Renee was. She was very quietly and privately very proud. She was proud of a lot of things in a way she had not let herself be when there was not enough margin to risk it. Later that evening, after Cora's session and the dinner rush and the close, Renee stayed alone in the diner after the last staff member left, the way she used to stay alone when she was just the woman who opened the place and who would be back again in 9 hours. She walked the floor. She checked the coffee station and the side stations and the pass-through window the way she always had, by muscle memory, automatically. She turned off the light above the counter, then she unlocked the back office and sat down at the desk that was now hers. It was a small desk, metal, a little dented, the kind of desk that has had several lives. There was a lamp on it and a notebook and a cup that held pens. She had put a photo of Cora on the corner, the school photo from September, orange shirt, loose front tooth, the laugh already starting before the camera caught her. Renee opened the notebook and wrote the next day's supply order in her careful, compact handwriting, the handwriting of someone who had learned early that paper was not infinite. She wrote the full list, the coffee and cream and cornbread mix and eggs and the rest. She closed the notebook. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the empty diner, her diner, with its worn-to-new booths and its old walls and its new light over the counter, and its menu with the cornbread on it, and she thought about a quarter on a counter and a paper bag, and a man who had been wet and hungry on a Tuesday in November and who had never once forgotten what it cost a person to be kind when kindness was not a small thing. She had not given him the cornbread because she expected the world to be fair. She had given it to him because it was the right thing, and because that was who she was, and because there are people in this world who do the right thing in the dark and trust, without proof, that the light will eventually find them. She turned off the desk lamp. She picked up her keys, the set Darnell had arranged for her, building key, front door, office and storeroom, the full ring, substantial in her hand, and she slipped them into her coat pocket and stood up. Have you ever done something kind for a stranger and never found out what became of them? Drop a comment and tell me. I want to know. And if you believe that a small act of grace can circle back years later and change everything, stay close, because the stories we have lined up next will feel very familiar. Renee turned off the office light and walked through the dark diner to the front door. She could see the street through the glass, the same street that had been there when she started, the same corner, same light changing at the intersection. Different night, different woman. She stepped outside and locked the door behind her. She stood for a moment in the cool air, the key ring in her hand, and she thought about Cora, sleeping at her grandmother's tonight, safe and warm, with a tutor and an orange shirt and a library book she was racing through at a second-grade pace. She thought about $72 in a savings account, and what it felt like to no longer know that number by heart. She put the keys in her pocket. She walked home. The weeks that followed were not easy in the way that people sometimes imagine a promotion to be. There was the paperwork, for one thing. Renee had signed more documents in the first 10 days of her new position than she had in the previous 31 years combined. Contracts with the food suppliers, employment agreements for the staff she was keeping, a lease addendum she had to have her cousin's husband, who knew something about commercial property law, read over at the kitchen table on a Sunday night while Cora slept in the back room. He had nodded and said it looked clean, and she had signed it with a pen that had run low and pressed harder than necessary to make the ink hold. She took a deep breath after each signature and moved to the next line. The renovations started on a Monday and lasted 19 days, which was 3 days over what the contractor had promised, a fact that did not particularly surprise Renee because nothing in her experience had ever come in exactly on schedule. She spent those 19 days at the Linden Group's central office 2 blocks away, working through the supply chain documentation Loretta had sent and sitting through 3 video calls with people whose job titles she was still learning to track. She was the only person in those calls who had ever worked a diner counter. She noticed that. She did not say anything about it. She took notes. On the 4th call, a man from the operations team said something about average ticket price that she knew was wrong, that did not reflect how diner regulars actually ordered or what upselling was possible at that price point without driving people away. And she said so clearly and with specific numbers, and there was a pause on the call, and then Darnell said, from somewhere slightly off camera, "She's right." And the operations man said, "Fair point," and moved on. After the call, Loretta sent her a message. It said, Good call. Renee read it twice. Then she went back to the supply chain documentation. The day the renovation finished, she walked the space alone, before the staff came in, before the painters had fully packed up their equipment. She walked it slowly, the way she had walked it for 6 years in the dark of the early morning, checking the stations and the floor and the pass-through window. The booths were the same shape with new upholstery. The counter was the same length. The coffee station was in the same place. Everything was familiar and nothing was the same. She stood in the middle of it for a moment and let herself feel that, the specific texture of something both known and new, like returning to a place after a long time away and finding that the place remembers you, even if it has changed its clothes. Then she went to work. The first week of the reopening was controlled chaos. Not bad chaos, not the kind that breaks things, but the kind that happens when a neighborhood place reopens after renovation and everyone who has been walking past the construction paper on the windows shows up on the same Tuesday morning to see what happened to their counter stool. Harold was there before she unlocked the door. He was standing on the sidewalk with his hands in his jacket pockets and a look of cautious approval on his face. And when he saw the booths, he said, "Red's a little brighter." And she said, "It'll settle." And he said, "Probably," and sat down and ordered his eggs. She served him herself, which she would not always be able to do now that she had a full staff and a manager's tasks. But she did it that morning because some things are more important than efficiency. Her mother came in that Thursday with Cora, who had been told 100 times that this was Mama's diner now, and who seemed to understand this in the way that 6-year-olds understand large things, which is to say in flashes and not fully, but with great enthusiasm. Cora sat at the counter and ordered the cornbread because she was her mother's daughter, and because the cornbread had been described to her in terms that made it sound like a marvel of human accomplishment, which it was not, but which it was also, in its way. She ate 2 pieces. She said it was the best thing she had ever eaten. Renee's mother, sitting on the stool beside her, caught Renee's eye over Cora's head and smiled in the way that mothers smile when they are watching a long road arrive somewhere it always should have gone. What Renee did not know yet, in those first weeks, was that Darnell had gone home the night he pulled the property address and spent an hour and a half trying to remember her name. He knew it had been on a name tag. He knew the name tag had been worn low on a server's apron. He knew the name started with an R. He had lain awake turning it over the way you try to recall a word that is right at the edge of memory. And he had finally given up and gone to sleep and told himself he would know it when he saw her, if it was her. It was her. He had known within the first 10 seconds of walking through the door, before she looked up from the coffee station, before he had seen her face clearly. He had known from the way she stood at the counter, which was the same way she had stood at the counter 3 years ago. Straight-backed, unhurried, present. A person who was exactly where they were, not somewhere else in their mind. He had been the regional director for Linden for 18 months by then, and he had visited 46 diners. And he had not seen someone run a floor with that quality of attention in all 46 of them combined. That was not sentiment. That was observation. He could separate the two. He had built his entire professional life on being able to separate the two. He had told the transition team that the Merchant Street location had exceptional staff leadership that should be preserved at all costs. He had told Loretta that the recommendation for general manager was not a close call. He had been clear and he had been honest, and he had not said any of what he might have said, which was that 3 years ago this woman had given him a paper bag of cornbread on the worst night of his year, and that he had thought about that bag more times than he could count, thought about it when he needed to remember that small things done with full attention were not small things at all. He had not said any of that in the professional context. It was not the right place for it. He said it to her on the day of the reopening, after Harold had his eggs and the morning rush had found its rhythm, and there was a brief window of relative stillness at the counter around 9:15. He had come back that morning, the way he said he would, with no portfolio and no agenda, and she had poured his coffee, and they had stood on either side of the counter in the noise and warmth of the reopened diner, and he had said it plainly and without making it larger than it was. He said, "That night 3 years ago, I had $12 and I was trying to figure out whether I had enough for soup. You gave me cornbread and you looked at me like I was a person. I've been in a lot of places since then. I don't forget that kind of thing." Renee held her coffee pot and looked at him. She said, "I do that for everybody." He said, "I know, that's the point." She thought about that later, closing up, and she thought about it again the following morning before she unlocked the door. She had not done anything unusual. She had done her job and been herself and treated a stranger with basic decency, and gone home and worried about her break job. She had not been performing. She had not been angling for anything. She had been a person in a diner at 7 in the evening who looked at another person and saw them. That was all. She had never known. It was enough. She had never known that doing the ordinary thing with full care and full attention was the thing the world eventually turned toward. She had believed it in the abstract, in the way that faith is belief in the abstract, but she had carried it quietly and without expectation, and she had never once let herself make it transactional, never let herself sit in the dark and think, well, I was kind, so where is my reward? The reward was not the point. The kindness was the point. The reward was just proof that the universe had been paying attention. She thought about her mother saying a long time ago, when Renee was maybe 15 and angry about something that now she could not even remember. The things you do when nobody is watching are the only things that count, her mother had said. Not because no one ever finds out, but because you'll know, and who you are when you think no one is looking is who you actually are. Renee had believed that. She had tried to live by it. She had lived by it on nights when living by it cost her something she did not have to spare. She stood in the quiet diner in the earliest dark of a Thursday morning, before her staff arrived, before Harold showed up for his eggs, before Cora came in with her reading book and her orange enthusiasm. And she looked at the keys on the ring in her hand and thought about all the mornings she had opened this place and gone home with tips in her pocket, and her car barely making it, and her account at a number that frightened her when she looked at it too directly. She thought about how those mornings had not been wasted. Not one of them. Every shift, every cup of coffee poured with attention, every regular greeted by name, every stranger looked at like a person, every small act of care performed in the ordinary light of a diner morning. None of it had been lost. It had all been accumulating somewhere she couldn't see, in the ledger that the world keeps even when people stop believing in it. She unlocked the front door, she turned on the lights over the counter, she started the coffee. This is a story about a woman who did not wait to be seen before she chose to be good. If you know someone like that, someone who gives without keeping score and who shows up with full attention when the room is empty and the tips are thin, leave their name in the comments. They deserve to be named. And if this story moved you, there is another one just like it waiting for you next, about a man who repaid a kindness he had owed for 20 years, and the life that changed because of it. She set the cups out on the counter, 12 of them in a row, as she had done every morning for 6 years. She straightened the menus. She wiped down the surface of the counter with a clean cloth, working from left to right, the way she always had. The same motion, the same attention, the same care for a space that was now, in every legal and professional and actual sense, hers. The bell above the door rang. Harold was early. She reached for the coffee pot and she smiled.